Welcome to tonight's seminar. My name is Peter Raftopoulos, President of the Ithacan Historical Society, which is proud to support our online lectures on the history of Ithaca and the broader Ithacan region. Gerasimos Livitsanis is an archaeologist based in Ithaca and currently working as a contract archaeologist for the Epiphyret for the Antiquities of Kefalonia, the regional branch of the Greek Archaeological Service. Gerasimos holds a master's degree in archaeology from Leiden University in The Hague, where his thesis titled Ithacans Bearing Pots examined pottery finds from the Polis Valley in Ithaca as evidence for social dynamics in the archaic and classical periods. To use Gerasimos' own words, Ithaca is an island not as much rich in history as in mythology, a problem to which he has directed his interests broadly. Gerasimos has recently focused his attention on the more tangible modern past, in particular the legacy of Venetian rule in the Ionian Islands. Archaeological interest in the landscape of post-Byzantine Greece has increased in recent years, though stunted by funding priorities that reflect the dominance of the classical. This is perhaps nowhere more apparent than in Ithaca. Tonight's lecture is based on Gerasimos' fieldwork among ruins of the early model settlements of the island. Following tonight's seminar, there will be time to ask questions, which we'll take from both YouTube and Zoom. We now warmly welcome Gerasimos Livitsanis to speak to us. Thanks, Gerasimos. Thanks very much, Gerasimos. You're back and ready to show your display and presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It's really great to be here. And to be honest, until about a year ago, I knew nothing about the Ithacan Philanthropic Society or the Ithacan Historical Society. It was only when Kyriako contacted me and told me all that, I said, yeah, I mean, it was great. And again, thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. We look forward to seeing your presentation now. Thanks very much.
Peter, I think you have disabled the screen sharing.
We can see you now.
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
I think Marcus can just be a co-host again.
Host, yep.
Yes.
I'll host you, yep. Good to go, Maki.
That's great. Can you see it?
All good now. Very good.
All good. Okay, then let's talk about some archaeology of the Venetian Ithaca. Okay, first of all, we'll talk generally about the island, then some words about vernacular architecture, ecclesiastical architecture, some pottery on the surface, as we see it, walking through the fields, and at the end, some iconographical sources that, thanks to Kyriako, I could find. So, first of all, the island. This is a map of the island we are all familiar with, and there is a clear north-south divide. The Isthmus of Aetos at the center of the island divides it into almost equal parts. In those two parts, we can identify more or less four main settlement chambers. these settlement chambers are areas that can sustain human habitation and life can flourish. Inside each settlement chamber, the focus of habitation and settlement can change through the time, depends on the circumstances. From the prehistory until Roman times, as we know through the archaeological remains, there are three main settlement chambers. Of the fourth, for the whole island, three were settled continuously and intensively. The area around Vathi, the main town today, the Isthmus of Aetos, and the area around the modern village of Stavros and Exogi. This is a map, perhaps kind of map, from Bondelmonti's Isolario in 1420, where he spots three settlements on the island. This is not a true map in the modern sense. It's more an aid memoir for the seamen of that period. However, if we see the Venetian settlements, the Venetian period settlements on the islands, there are three main settlement chambers that were habitated. We know them from the written sources already in the 16th century. The first one was Vathi, the second Anoi, and the third one Stravonikou in the 16th century. And around the turn of the 17th, it changed its name to Dragoniko, and then about a couple of decades later, it became Oxoi, Exogi, as we know it today. The Venetians call them ville. Usually we translate ville as villages. Not exactly. It's not a village. It's more than a settlement chamber, the term villa. As a case study, if we take Vathi Villa, the settlement chamber, there are three settlements. The main one, which is at Perahori today, and it was called Horio Vathiou, the village of Vathi. The Porto or Molos Vathiou, which was the port town, today's Vathi, and it was not the main settlement, but it was the harbor town. And there was a minor settlement, the so-called Rizes, towards the southern extremity of the island. But the main settlement was at Perahori until the middle 18th century. If we see this a kind of topographical map of the Venetian Perahori, you see the outline boxes are houses, and the full squares are the churches. Anyhow, this is a work in progress, but we can see that the settlement of the Venetian period is articulated in 7 more or less neighborhoods. And usually these neighborhoods, these settlement parts, let's say, they were built on the ridge lines. In fact, we also have a photograph of the late 19th century of Venetian Perahori. You can see, if you can follow the red lines, the one on the left above the line, there is a line of houses. Then the second from the left red line, to the right, there's another line of houses. And then at the center, the red line, to the left of it, another one, always following the ridge lines. We always build houses on the ridge lines. And to the right, another above the red line, also another string of houses. This photograph was taken, yes, at the end of the 19th century, and the settlement was already in ruin. So in this case, inside each settlement chamber, there was always a shift of focus in habitation from uplands to lowlands. horizontal distances are not large. However, they are not practicable because there are so many mountains going straight into the sea. So you have to move uplands and lowlands. Vertical distances equally short, but more practicable within its settlement chamber. And as I said before, in each settlement chamber, the focus of habitation can shift. In one period, the uplands are more intensively settled. In other periods, according to changing circumstances, the ports towns can become the focus of settlement. And turning to vernacular architecture, what we see on the ground, this is the simplest form of a house in a state of near total destruction. It is a long rectangular building. If we see another one in a better state of preservation, we can see its features. It has a back wall. It almost always sunk into the slope, and the front wall on the right of this picture, where the door is at the center of the long outer wall. It is always, almost always, at the center. It is a long rectangular house, like this one. You see the back wall on the left, it is sunk into the slope, the outer wall on the right with the door at the center. This example here is paved with stone slabs, and at the center, as one enters from the entrance, there is a cistern also. And another example for Anoyi. This one, Kyriako. This is Kyriako knocking at the door. At the center of the long wall, of the outer long wall, the back wall on the right, again sunk into the slope, and at the center of the house, a cistern. You can also see here the feature of the short side of its house, which had a pediment. The roof was gabled, double sloped, and at the short sides, it had a pediment, the so-called atsupi. So we call these two short sides with the pediments atsupia. So the roof was atsupada, as we say, our ancestors said, and we continue to say that, not very much, but we used to say it, an atsupada roof. This one is another example from Perachori, a long rectangular house called usually makrinari, long house. To the right is the back wall sunk into the slope. To the left is the outer long wall with the door at the center, and at the short sides, the pediments for the roof, which nothing remains, of course, besides the tiles, the broken tiles which are everywhere on the ground. This one from Perachori again is a particular example because it is very long. Usually the analogy between length and width is about 2:1 or even 3:1. So in general, they are long houses. This one in particular is very, very long. It's 30 meters long and 7 meters wide. If we look closer, this is the short side with the pediment, what remains of the pediments at the short side, the atsupi, for the gabled roof. And here on the left, you can see one of the three doors, which sometime it was narrowed in, and you can see the lintel. This is typical of the Venetian lintels in vernacular archaeology. They were horizontal. On the top right, you can see at one short end of that long house, there is a structure like a veranda or something, which was not roofed or covered. That was a courtyard. It was usual for these ground floor houses to have a courtyard at the front, or when the slope was too steep, as in this case, the courtyard was at one outer short side of the house. And on right bottom, you can see one of the doors of the same house. It had 3 doors, as I said before. Now, this is an example, another example of a door which still remains and is open. You can see it is at the center of the long wall, and it has a horizontal lintel. This is a view, an outer view. This is an inner view, the same door with a lintel. And on top left, you can see there was a small window on top left. Windows are usually, no, they are rare. You can see in all this settlement, 2 or maybe 3 small windows. And they were placed usually, obviously, on the long outer wall and very close to the roof line. This is an example, another example of a door which remains in place with a horizontal lintel, although this house was a 2-story building, and this was not the entrance. It was a back door leading to a courtyard, a back courtyard. This is another door with a big, large horizontal lintel, and this one also is from a 2-story house, and this is the ground floor entrance. This is an example, another example of a window, a very small square window on the outer wall, usually next to the door, but as I said, windows are very, very rare. And those rectangular macrinaria longhouses can combine together, usually at their length. So we have expansion joints. A new house is built next to an older one using a joint. And by observing joints, we can see which building was the older one and which one was the newer. Usually they are the so-called averfomeria. So it was the newer house was the building of the brother or of a son, and it was built next to the house of his parents or his older brother. So they are called averfomeria. This one from Anogi, an example, is another subtype of the long house. You can see the long house on the right of the picture, and here on the front, there is an adjoint wing at the edge of the outer face of the house. So the house assumes a plan, an L-shaped plan. As you can see this from Google Earth, again from Anogi, they are the same houses. The nucleus of the house is the typical long house, and at the edge of the outer long wall, another room is adjoined. So the overall plan of the house is an L-shaped, and this we call it a sette type house. Sette comes from the Italian number 7. So that is the letter gamma, the Greek letter gamma, or the L, the letter L in English or Latin, and the number 7, which makes this angle. That's why we used to call it sette plan house. There is another one from Anogidis, from Google Earth, another long house with adjoint houses, and at the end, at one edge, they add a wing forward at the outer wall of the long house and becomes an L-shaped house. This example is from Perachori, a well-preserved ruin. The long house with an internal division with a small wall, and at the outer face, at the edge, there is an adjoint room, and it takes the L shape. This one is the same house from looking from the Google Earth. Then moving, there is another type of house. These tall walls belong to a two-story house. So this is a view from the interior. You can see it's still a rectangular long house, but it has an upper floor. The short side is again with a pediment. The roof is always gabled, a double sloped with pediments, a choupia. The entrance, the back wall on the right is again sunk into the slope. On the left, the outer wall has the entrance at the center, almost always at the center, not always, but almost always. And usually, also, it can take the L-shaped form, this subtype. This one is again a two-story house. As you can see, the door, the entrance is at the center of the long wall on the upper floor. And to reach the entrance, there was a structure with an external staircase adjacent to the long wall, leading to a porch called mojos. That mojos, that porch, could be solid, as in this case, you can see on the right what remains of the staircase. Of course, it's not perfectly preserved, and which leads to the mojos, a porch, right in front of the entrance. And then you go in the upper floor. Usually, the ground floor in this case was used as a magazine or for housing the domestic animals, or both. Here you can see an arched porch, a mojos. This has not an entrance leading to the ground floor, but there was a staircase leading on top of this mojos, of this porch, which enabled someone to enter the upper floor. This is from the same photograph we saw before. This is another two-story house, and maybe you can glimpse a detail of the arched porch in front of the house, the mojos. This is the house as it remains now, with small windows. Again, the windows are still small. This is what remains of the external staircase adjacent to the outer wall. And this is what remains of the arched porch, the mojos. And on the left was the entrance to the upper story. And exactly below that was the entrance to the ground floor, which was a magazine, probably. Now, this is a drawing by Ludwig Salvator at the turn of the 20th century. And on the left, we can see the abbot's house at Taxiarchon Monastery at Perachori. And you can see how this two-story house of the Venetian period looked. A two-story house, the living quarters on the upper floor, a central door at the center, two small windows on each side of the door, an external staircase leading to the top of a porch, an arched porch in this case, the mojos, and above the entrance and this porch was the so-called loggia, which was nothing more than a cover for that top of the porch of the mojos. And here is another example from Corfu, Peroulades village at Corfu. Keep in mind that this plan of two-story houses continued to be built well into the 19th century, or even in some cases, well into the 20th century, but in rural areas. This is an example. I'm not certain about its dating. However, it retains all the characteristics of the two-story houses of the Venetian period. And the characteristic is these mojos, these external mojos, the external staircase and the arched porch with the loggia above. Now, in this frontispiece of an administrative document dated in 1727, Kyriako found this, and he was kind enough to show me. You can see on the right, you can see a drawing. It looks more like a kindergarten drawing, but it is significant because it shows that the secretary of the administration knew how a two-story house looked like. It was usually, and it is still called palati. A two-story house is called palati. And on the right, you can see one example with each door above the other, and the windows one above the other, and the external staircase leading to the upper floor. External staircase adjacent to the outer wall, leading to the upper floor entrance. Of course, in this case, it shows a second floor, a three-story house. Maybe it was a kind of artistic license, you can say so. But it certainly shows the gabled roof with the achupi, the pediment, although it shows frontally and not laterally, which is, let's say it was a kind of artistic license. It also shows the chimneys for the smoke. Another characteristic of all houses in both types, even a single-story long house and the two-story palati, was the so-called armari. They were cupboards built into usually the back wall. They are small, square, usually, but not always. On the top left, you can see a more well-made armari. They were cupboards simply to store things of everyday use, we could say. And as for the smoke, how to manage the smoke in the house, the usual answer is the chimney, but not always. Here we can see a fragment of a tile, a perforated tile. It's the so-called anaphoros. This was a tile with this hole with a stick. You can slide it up and down, so you have an opening on the roof. The smoke goes out, and then you slide it back in, and you have a sealed and closed roof. This is how perhaps the poorer houses manage the smoke inside the house with this simple instrument, a perforated pierced tile. And usually people say that the beveled foot of a house, some houses have a beveled footing, the so-called scarpa, belongs to the Venetian period. I don't think so. On Ithaca, at least on Ithaca. This scarpa, I have seen this in this case at Anogi, and another case more prominent at Perachori, this one. However, it is, from what I have seen, and I have seen enough, it seems to be later than the Venetian period. I would pinpoint the extensive use of scarpa towards the end of the 18th century and in the beginning of the 19th. From what I have seen, this beveled foot in the Venetian period is very rare, at least on Ithaca. Maybe in other islands is more frequent, but on Ithaca is rare. So, to sum up, housing typology. We have two basic types of houses. The first type is a single-story long house, the macrinari, and my Cephalonian friends call it macronora. And the second type is a two-story palati. Palati means palace. But people, even in that time, used to call this two-story house a palati, a palace. Both types can assume the subtype attributes of L-shaped, sete, at the front, or longitudinal attachments. So one building is adjoined to an older one, and they become longer and longer. And it becomes a very, very long house. Both one-story house and two-story houses. The single-story long house, the macrinari, its dimensions are usually from 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. The door is almost always at the center of the outer long wall. The back wall is usually called adigos, at perahori, or endigos, at anogi. I have heard it in both ways. Endigos usually at anogi, and adigos at perahori. And that is always sunk into the slope. Windows are rare and very small. When there is only one, and it is a small one. The roof is double sloped with pediments, atsupia. Sometimes there is a loggia, the open-walled monosloped roofed porch at the entrance of the house, even in the ground floor houses. And the courtyard is at the front of the house or adjoined to the short side. Then the two-story palati. Its main characteristic is the mojos with external staircase adjacent to the wall, a porch, arched or solid, and the loggia. All this complex is mojos. Some people say that mojos is only the porch. Anyway. The door is almost always at the center of the long wall, as in the one-story building, which you can access the entrance through the staircase and the mojos. The windows, there are some more than in the single-story houses, but they still remain small. It is again double-sloped gable roof with pediments at tsupia at the sides, at the short sides, never at the front. And this time the courtyard is not at the front of the house. The front of the house is always on the road. And the courtyard is moved back, at the back of the house, and you can access it through an upper floor back door. Now, the governor's quarters, or what I think it is. Ithaca in the Venetian period had a governor, who was a Cephalonian always. Each year there was a different one. He was elected by the community of Cephalonia for 1 year. And on Ithaca there was the so-called Demotion Palation, or the public palace. His quarters, both his residence and his office. And until 1757, this public palace was at Perahori. That was the governor's place. I mean, now, is there any possibility to identify one of those ruined houses now that could be the governor's quarters until at least 1757? Maybe it's this one. Maybe the one you see on the photograph is as you enter Perahori on your left-hand side, just above the road. These are two palatia, one attached to each other longitudinally. As you can notice at the center, there is the joint. So the building on the right was the older one, and the building on the left was the later one. They are both two-story houses. You can also see the pediment on the right of the photograph. A double gabled roof, double sloped roof. And on the left-hand building, you can glimpse maybe behind the olive tree what remains of the external staircase and the mojos leading to the entrance of the upper floor. And maybe one or two small windows. This is a view of the building complex from the later one looking towards the older one. And you can see at the center a blocked small window of the older building. Here is the short side of the newer building with, at the ground floor, a very small window, and on the upper floor there was another window, not very large, but a bit larger than the one of the ground floor. And this is a view from the older building looking towards the newer building. This is a double-story long house, which is long. It's nearly 30 meters long and 7 meters wide. It is a large house. It has some peculiarities. Now, through the red arrow, you can see the joint. So you can see that this wall in front of us was built later than the building on the left. The blue arrow shows a step for the pavement of the upper floor, and the green arrow shows it's not a window, it's a slit beside the door. And as we can see in the next one on top left, these are musket slits flanking the entrance. And here on the bottom right, you can see a small opening in the wall, in the back wall of this building. There are a few more. And these are very discreet lookouts. Someone from the inner side can look outside through these small openings. So these features makes this building complex a little particular. To sum up, they are two adjoined palaces. This building significantly has a legacy among the inhabitants of Perahori. They call it the prison or the courthouse. So there is a legacy that this building had a public character. Maybe it's not a legacy from the Venetian period, maybe from later, from 19th century, from the British period. However, this is the only house with this kind of legacy. And we know that the governor of Ithaca in the Venetian period had the right to judge people or even has a small garrison. Moreover, it seems to have never been a private property. I asked many people at Perahori, nobody knows who this building complex belongs to. It seems to belong to nobody. it seems that it has always remained public. It has those musket sleeves. It has those discrete lookouts, which give it a kind of fortified character. And all those characteristics lead me to think that maybe this building was the governor's quarters. Maybe. It's just a hypothesis or a working hypothesis. And going back to the same photograph with those drawings, if you look at the bottom left, you can see two-story houses adjacent to each other. And these drawings were made by the secretary of the governor in the beginning, in the first quarter of the 18th century. And maybe, I just say maybe, he was trying to illustrate the house he lived besides the governor. And it looks pretty much like the above building we just saw. There is another drawing here from 1730, again found by Kyriako, which shows here, you can see on the right, a long house. So those people had some artistic interest and tried to depict some buildings anyway. Now we turn to ecclesiastical architecture, which is prominent enough even today. This is the well-known Panagia Church at Anogi. And you can see, besides its religious character, in its essence, it's a long house. It's a long rectangular building with pediments at the short sides and a double-sloped roof. It is exactly as the simple one-story houses or even two-story houses. The only difference are those characteristics which make it a church, like the apsis. This is a highly decorative portal of the church, maybe of the 17th century. I cannot tell with certainty. And this is its interior in all its glory, with the iconostasis, which in Ithaca is almost always built of masonry. It's stone built. The iconostasis, the templon, it's not wooden. It is always, almost always, of masonry. And this is the better preserved example. And you can see the date of the wall paintings of 1680 in Greek numbers. Alpha, Chi, P, 1680. This is a better preserved church of the Venetian period on Ithaca, and it is also the oldest building still in use on the island. This is the church of Ioannis St. John at Perachori with the belfry, with its belfry. Again, a rectangular structure with pediments on the short sides and gabled roof. And this is the masonry iconostasis as it was restored, kind of, about 20 years ago. This is a photograph of Ludwig Salvator in the beginning of the 20th century. This is another St. John, not the previous one. Another St. John at Perachori, but not the previous one. This is the masonry iconostasis with the wall paintings as it appeared in the beginning of the 20th century. And this is how it appears today. it is almost destroyed because it has always remained unprotected. But you can still glimpse some details of the wall paintings. From that church, we have this stone with a Maltese type cross and the date 1719, if I read it well. Could be 1710 or 1719. Anyway, in the beginning of the 18th century. This is another masonry iconostasis from Agios Nikolaos, St. Nicholas, again at Perachori. This one also remains unprotected and still retains many of its wall paintings. Another one, this one is Agia Paraskevi, again at Perachori, and again a masonry iconostasis. You see here the details of what remains of the wall paintings and inside the apsis, not only on the iconostasis. This is from St. Nicholas at Anogi. And this picture shows how this masonry iconostasis was built. A very complex structure, but it was usual on Ithaca. It is almost unknown at Cephalonia, almost unknown. On Ithaca is usual, and at Lefkada there are some cases. It is not as rare. Not very usual, but not rare. There are examples. So maybe Ithacans were influenced from the Lefkadians in order to use and employ and build the masonry iconostasis. This particular church, St. Nicholas at Anogi, as you can see, it had two entrances, one on each long side, at least two windows, one on each, at least one, because the rest of it, as you can see, is destroyed, and two windows behind the camera at the short side and another door. So it seems to me it was the most luminous church of the Venetian period on the island, because usually the churches were dark. They had only one main door, one door for the women section, and maybe one or two small windows. They were dark places, churches. This church in particular was very luminous, and this was a surprise for me. Now, again, St. Nicholas, you can see on the arch of the door a cross, a Maltese type cross, and on a stone it is incised the date of construction 1696. So at the end of the 17th century. And this is the apsis, the outer face of the apsis of a church at Vathi, Vlacherena, and it has this relief, a highly decorative relief, which has the date of construction, and it is 7 August 1792. So in the last years of the Venetian period, and this very nice relief, maybe it is an allegory of the divine judgment. Those reliefs on the church apsis were common throughout the Greek world at the turn of the 19th century, the last decades of the 18th century and the first couple of decades of the 19th, before the revolution. They were relatively common. And this is the bell tower, the belfry of Anogi, of the Church of Panagia at Anogi. And it seems from an incision that it is dated in 1611, as you can see in the photograph on the right. So we know that there was a church of Panagia at Anogi in the middle of the 16th century from a notary document. We know that the church existed in 1565, if I remember well. Maybe perhaps not the same structure as it is today, but there was a church, and through the centuries undertook many refurbishments and arrived to us as we see it today. However, in the middle of the 16th century seems to have existed. So to build a belfry in the beginning of the 17th century is not out of question. And it seems to be confirmed by this incision. And as we know, the wall paintings, at least that phase, the phase we see today of the wall paintings, was undertaken towards the end of the 17th century, in 1680, as we said before. Belfries on Ithaca are rare. They are not common. They exist, but they are not common. They are rare. This is a fine example, which still remains. Some of them have been demolished after the earthquakes of 1953, especially at Vathi. And this is the belfry of St. John at Perachori, which dates probably in the 18th century, probably, but I'm not certain. And belfries, Perachori had many churches of the Venetian period. And there are only two belfries. This St. John and at Agia Paraskevi, another one. So I tend to think that belfries and they were always of this type, just a skin, a wall, a simple wall, a skin called a vela, mean sail-like. It was a sail because it was only one wall. It is not a tower structure, just a simple wall, decorated, of course, in the Venetian style, but just a wall. So to sum up, church architecture. In its essence, a church is a longhouse structure. The same architect that would build my house could build a church. Longhouse in one case, a longhouse in the other case. Of course, a church had its peculiarities. The masonry iconostasis. The belfries were rare and always sail-like, a vela or plaqué, as people call them. And the architectural features that make that building become a church. The apsis, the iconostasis, arched openings, usually, as we see in vernacular architecture, windows and doors are always rectangular, and the lintels are always horizontal, but churches have arched doors and windows. And of course, wall paintings. Their location. They are always on the ridge line, as it is at Perachori and at Exogi. And they seem to have been placed at the outskirts of the settlement. So it is not a typical Greek village with the church at the main square of the village. So that the church at the center and the village developing around this church. No, in our case, the churches are always placed or on a ridge line or at the outskirts of the settlement. It's something like a frontier or something. Now, what we find on the surface from small finds, pottery, most usually pottery. And this is how pottery shards appear on the surface among the stones and other stuff. And looking closely at those shards, we can also find some diagnostic. Those colored painted are the so-called maiolica, and many of them were imported from Italy. And on the bottom left, you can see a not painted, a shard of a non-painted vase with fine incisions. This was also a characteristic form of the Venetian period. Here again, a couple of shards with green painting. And at Tanogi, I was lucky enough to identify this. This is a fragment of a tobacco pipe that was lying on the ground, dated in the 17th or 18th century. This is of the Eastern tradition, the Eastern Ottoman tradition, this pipe, this one with this long stem. And here on the right, you can see a similar example of a pipe, how it would be if it was complete and not broken as in our case. So the pottery can confirm that all this, that the ruined settlement is dated in the Venetian period, at least the surface pottery. We have not undertaken any excavations on the settlements, unfortunately, so far. Now, if we turn to iconographical sources, we have been lucky because towards the end of the 18th century, the French ambassador to Constantinople, Choiseul Gouffier, he hired several painters and enlisted them in the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean, to paint the sceneries, or maybe for his archaeological interests. One of them was Louis-François Cassas, who arrived on Ithaca. And we have from him at the Louvre Museum today 2 depictions of Vathie in 1785. And this Cassas was so talented that his depictions are almost photograph accurate. They have some photographic accuracy. I mean, his drawings are outstanding. Here you can see one view of Vathie looking towards what is now the square of Vathie. You can read on the top a view of Vathie in the island of Chiaki, taken from the east side of the port. And here is the other view of Vathie. On the left is the church, in the left middle is the church of Panagia, the so-called Gardelaki here at Vathie. And on the bottom right is Lazaretto, when it was still a monastery of Pantocrator. It was not yet a Lazaretto, but a monastery. And here we can see some details from his drawings. On the top left, we can see a single story, a ground floor, long house with an added room at the front, and it becomes an L-shaped house. On top right, again, an L-shaped house. You can see on the left of this with 2 windows or doors, this long house, a ground floor long house with an added room at the front edge, and the same at the center, a long house behind, not the front one, behind that, with an added wing, and becomes an L shape. On the bottom left, we can see a palati at the water's edge. This is a palati, the two-story house. You can see the gabled roof, the pediments on the short sides, the atsupia, the few and small windows, the external staircase adjacent to the outer wall, the mojos, and the loggia, the porch above the mojos, is at the entrance, at the main entrance of the house. And on bottom right, we can see on the left the same palati, and on the right, this is the newest for that period development in vernacular architecture, as it seems. Again, a two-story long house, but this time with many and larger windows. And this must have been a development of the second half or fourth quarter of the 18th century. But even that, it still retains the characteristic entrance at the center of the long wall, the loggia, the porch above the entrance, and the external staircase to reach the entrance of the upper floor. And you can also see a ship in ordinary, as it seems, just in front of this house. And here we can see details from Kassas drawings again of ecclesiastical architecture at Vathi. On top left, we can see Gardelaki, which is on top of the hill behind today's town hall, as it was then, towards the end of the 18th century. The church building, the belfry, and an outbuilding, which does not exist anymore, and even the belfry that was of the Venetian period, it doesn't exist. On top right, we can see Agios Spiridonas, Saint Spiridion, the older church, the so-called Bazigos, as it looked then. On bottom left, we can see the Church of Pantocrator at Lazaretto, and as I said, it was a monastery back then. And in bottom right, we can see the belfry of Saint Nicholas here at Vathi. That belfry stood until 1953, when it was demolished. It was demolished after the earthquakes. Only the top was destroyed by the earthquake itself. The rest of it stood on its place, but it was demolished. And finally, if we can say something about artistic interests in the Venetian periods, we can find some expressions on the administrative books. This one, maybe someone could see a doodle of a human figure frontally looking, but it's not very clear. Here it becomes clear. On top left, you can see a kind of human figure with a big nose and an open mouth and a beard, a long beard. On the top right, a human figure much better executed, much more natural. And a couple of human heads just to the right of the letters. And here on top, above the letter B, we can see again a very well executed human head with a long beard and long hair. And on the bottom left, we can see again a human figure. And if we look more closely, we can see maybe that figure looking or holding an icon, a religious icon. And perhaps we can also identify this icon with the type of η Παναγία Γλυκοφιλούσα, the sweet kissing Madonna. And that is all, guys. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Gerasimos, thank you very much for your excellent presentation on Ithaca's fascinating Venetian period. I'm sure many of us now have a much better understanding.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Gerasimos. I'm sure we've got a much better understanding of this period after listening to your seminar, and we look forward to your...
I hope so.
We hope so too. And we look forward to your continued work on Ithaca and the discoveries that you will be no doubt making in the years ahead, I'm sure. Your work has been really invaluable so far, and to understanding the life on Ithaca and the Ionian Islands as a whole. So we really thank you for your great passion and in uncovering this archaeological work and making it available to us.
You are welcome. You are most welcome, Peter. Thank you for having me here again.
Excellent. Thank you, Gerasimos. Now, I'd like to open to questions, because I'm sure people will have questions in regards to the Venetian period. So if we can focus on questions on the Venetian period, Gerasimos will be able to answer those questions for you. Who would like to ask the first question?
I have a question, Peter. Andrew Raftopoulos here.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew.
Maki,
hello.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It was excellent. I just had a question about the 18th century domestic architecture, residential architecture, the longhouses and the others you presented. There wasn't a lot of evidence in terms of them the space being partitioned into rooms. It always looked like it. Now, was that the case, or were there partitions that generally were lost over time? And also, just to follow up question, I'm familiar with what is probably, and you can clarify this for me, the architecture which appears to be maybe later in time, where the two-story, particularly the two-story buildings, began to have well-crafted stonework, including these stone brackets which supported wrought iron balconies and then shutters, which had a very much a Georgian type of feeling, a very simple Georgian archetype form. Is that when did that sort of architecture appear in Ithaca? Was it during the advent of the English period, for instance, or was it earlier?
Okay, thank you, Andrew, so much.
Maki, I'd like to let you know that Andrew is an architect here in Melbourne, so that's why he's quite detailed in asking that question.
It's great to have him. Thank you, Andrew, for the question.
Pleasure.
We must keep in mind that Ithacans, and particularly those people from Anouilh, were extremely accomplished masons. They were great. They could make anything. However, having said that, highly decorative stonework on the balconies and on the openings is a late feature. I would pinpoint it towards the end, in the second half of the 18th century, towards the end of the Venetian period. And keep in mind that balconies is a 19th century feature. There were no balconies before, only the mojos and the loggia that worked as a balcony, more or less as a balcony. But there were no true balconies in the Venetian period.
So you said, excuse me, they appeared in the second half of the 18th century, late 1700s, through to the 19th.
the decorative stonework, the highly polished stonework on the openings, at the doors and at the windows. It starts towards the end of the 18th century. Not that before were known or were less well executed. They were fine. But this polite decoration in the openings is a kind of late feature. And the balcony is 19th century phenomenon.
I see.
So,
and also the windows obviously became much larger.
yes, yes.
Is that because
yes, much larger.
glass and so on was a scarce commodity and it became more available later in the piece?
I don't think, Andrew, let me tell you, in the Venetian period, although the openings were few and small, the houses are not huts. They are true houses. I mean, if you have a 75 square meter house, one story, ground floor house, it's not a hut. It's a true house. It's a true house for that period. For that period. So, I'm sorry, I forgot. So about the internal partitions, yes, they are rare in the longhouses. They are rare, and perhaps they were of perishable material, maybe woodwork, maybe woodwork, or even yes, or a kind of carpet or something like that. But they were perishable materials, and we have to consider that a longhouse, one part of the longhouse was the living quarters for the people, and the other side was for the domestic animals. So one side of the building was the so-called gonia, where the people lived, ate, slept, and the other side for the animals, the so-called ahuri, where the domestic animals, maybe a cow or a couple of goats or a couple of sheep.
And in the palati form, the two-story, the ground floor, or the katoi, where I think is referred to as katoi.
Yes, exactly.
Was the animals or big pitharia with olive oil or wine barrels and things like that. It's basically
or currants,
storage.
or raisins.
Because I imagine most of them are dug into the rear wall, is cut into the earth,
natural rock,
and they wouldn't have been very dry. They would have been quite damp because of water penetrating so they weren't probably suitable for human habitation. And
this is something we all consider. However, these settlements are in the uplands, where humidity is less than in the lowlands. And I'm quite sure that those people were not naive. They knew how to manage with moisture and all that. Because we see this phenomenon again and again and again in about 3 centuries, or even more recently, even in the 19th century. I'm quite sure that those people knew how to manage. And to return, I'm sorry, to return to the large windows, maybe we can see a social change that towards the end of the 18th century, the windows become more and larger. Previously, with few or none and small windows, someone wants his privacy. I don't want the people outside to see what is happening inside. So I don't want windows. I want only one entrance, which I can control. However, towards the end of the 18th century, if I have many and large windows, people can see what is happening inside. So maybe I want to show off. I have the desire for the people to see how I live. What is my success?
Yes.
Social success. I have a 2-story palati, a large house, not a ground floor house, and I want to show off. I want people to see my furniture. I want people to see how my kids and my wife dresses. I can control it, of course. I still can control it, but sometimes I want to be more visible to the society.
It's a measure of social status.
Yes, 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 yes. It's at least what I think.
No, it's very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mike. Congratulations. Very, very good talk.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
There's a question from Krista. We've got, was there any indication of wooden shutters?
Yes, yes, there is. In some cases, there are hinges, iron hinges to the doors and to some windows. Yes, there is evidence for wooden shutters.
Excellent. And we've just before Kyriako answers, we've just had a comment saying a brilliant talk, Maki, and this person who's recently visited Old Anoyi has a much better understanding of what they actually saw. So they're really appreciative of your explanation there. Kyriako, a question from you?
Although, I'm sorry, although at Anoyi, I looked for, I will go again. I will go. I have not seen a palati yet.
Right.
I have not seen a palati. Ground floor houses, yes. Single story houses, yes. A palati, not yet. Of course. Anoyi is a place that has been habitated continuously. And there are some distractions, reconstructions, and maybe they do not remain anymore. But they seem not to survive palatia from Anoyi. At Perahori, yes. At Perahori, yes. And several, not only one.
Very good. Very good.
Okay, I'm sorry for the interruption.
No, thank you very much, Maki. Thank you. Kyriako, another question from you.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you so much, Maki, for the excellent talk. It's been great finally to see what I've been expecting for so long. We've had many discussions, which have been fascinating. I wanted to jump in after Andrew's fascinating questions because you got to the point of the question of social stratification, which I am working on in my own research. And I wanted to start with the fact that we know from the Venetian administrative documents that there was a small class of regional political elites in each of these 3 ville. Precisely, you had sindici, who were the highest local representatives of the population in the colonial administration. And there's sindici from Anoyi, Exoyi, and Basi. And that is merely an indication that there was some kind of social stratification, which was then recognized or formalized through this political form. And as an archaeologist, I wanted to ask you for what evidence from the material culture that you found, particularly the pottery shards, interests me most, I think. I wanted to ask, do these, at this stage, from what you found in the location of particular shards within different type houses, are there any indications of of that might confirm grander or more elite housing and poorer and more simple housing, are these aligned with the nature of the more or less decorative pottery shards that you found so far?
Okay, so about pottery, no. I have seen so little and surface pottery, but that I cannot tell anything about social stratification through the pottery. And consider that in order to find a representative portion of pottery, we need to excavate. And we have not done this yet. An excavation would produce hundreds, if not thousands of shards. And then we can study them. So pottery does not tell me anything so far. Imported pottery, there is, obviously, but anyone can bring it in. Even the lesser seaman can bring one, not from Italy, from Cephalonia, from Lefkada, even from the continent. These were things that were circulating widely. It's everywhere. On architecture, yes, I can see social stratification. The palatia, the two-story houses, palatia, belong to the upper class. It's a social statement. A palati is a social statement. Not that it was forbidden for common people, let's say common people, to build a palati, but I think only the upper class could afford it and needed a storage area like that of the katoi. So we have the ground floor, which is the katoi, and the upper floor, the living quarters, which was the anoi. So the building is anogokatogo. This storage space was for the upper merchant class. The landowners who would collect the production, mainly currants, raisins, which was the staple currants cash crop for Ithacans. They enriched themselves from currants, oil, and wine in less portions. And these were sometimes called seraya, the ground floor of a palati. The upper floor was the living quarters, and the magazine below was the seraya, was the magazine for the currants. And maybe there was a trapdoor from the upper floor to the ground floor, so it could communicate. The owner, who was both a landowner and a merchant, having connections with the British, who were the merchants of the currants, to take it to England. So I can see in vernacular architecture, I can see social stratification. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
There's a question from Chris Kangas. He said, "Wonderful talk, Maki. Thank you very much for that." He has a question. How did you decide that the Scarpa is younger than the Venetian period?
Because I can't find it. I only have two examples. In dozens of houses, dozens and dozens, I only find it twice. And one of them at Perahori, I'm not certain if it is of the Venetian period. Maybe it could be from the beginning of the 19th. But at Anogi, for example, I found it only once. One picture I saw. At Vathi, for example, we have a couple of Scarpa houses, but they are 19th century. And even the so-called Palace of Janis at Stavros, at the center of Stavros, with the prominent Scarpa, it is 19th century, early 19th century. It is not Venetian. Doesn't seem to be Venetian. It has some characteristics. Yes, some architectural characteristics that come from the Venetian period, but overall, that structure, not as it looks today, which is 20th century, okay? But the most ancient characteristics of that palati is 19th century, early 19th century. In fact, I have an illustration that this building existed in 1814, and I hope to publish it soon. I have no evidence before the 19th century. Maybe it was a building of the early 19th century. Of course, we say Venetian period, it ends in 1797. Okay, people's, how to say, people don't change because a political regime changes. They remain the same. Masons became the same. They learn to do one thing, they will continue to do that. Even if the Venetians go away and the French and then the Russians and then the British come, for at least a generation, they will continue to do the same thing. But I hardly found the Scarpa in the Venetian period, on Ithaca, okay, on Ithaca.
Sure, no, that's good, Maki. There's another question by Chris. He mentions about a palati in Anoyi, one by the Seat Noihi, both owned by the Sidimis family. Are you aware of that one?
No. I'd very much like to see that.
Maybe we can get you in touch with Chris and
Absolutely.
you can maybe do some research there and get back to that. That'll be wonderful. And
yes, fine. And in fact, I will go soon in the next days. I will go again at Anoyi.
Fantastic.
And I would like to see as much as possible.
We will try to get you in touch with Chris, and he will be able to provide some location details, and then hopefully you can do some work that you can get back to us. We'd love to have an update on that one. And there's also there's a question actually from Georgiana, it's Anita Moreno, about the Church of the Dominion in Anoyi. I think you covered it, that it was in the 1680. You mentioned that church.
The wall paintings. The wall paintings. The church seems to have existed already in the mid 16th century. Perhaps not exactly the same structure. Okay, but a church of Panagia at that place seems to have existed in the mid 16th. But of course, changes happen.
Yes.
Wall paintings change. You tear down the older face and then you remake it in a different style, maybe, because something you like more. So the wall painting is one thing. The date of the structure of the building is another one.
Yes.
What we can say is that the date of the wall paintings is a terminus ante quem for the building. So the building was certainly built before the wall paintings.
You mentioned a date of 1565.
Yes.
That's for that particular church, Maki, you're talking about?
They say a church of Madonna. There is no other. There's no other. It has to be that. It has to be that.
Excellent.
I cannot say 100% certainly. However, it seems to have been that.
Sure.
Not, I say again, not the exact same structure as we see it today.
Sure.
Maybe a different one, an early phase, an earlier structural phases. Yes, okay, but it seems to have existed.
Now, Maki, I think one question I think that is maybe on everyone's list that the elephant in the room, as they say. You being an archaeologist, we'll just briefly touch on Mycenaean architecture and ruins on Ithaca. Are there any Mycenaean ruins? And also, what are your views on Homer's school, or Iosathanasis, as it's called? What are your views on that area?
Mycenaean remains are everywhere. If you read the excavation reports from the 19th and 20th century, in every place of Ithaca has been found Mycenaean material. Maybe not much, in some places more, and in some places less, but there is. It is well known, they are not there, and consider that Ithaca has never been excavated intensively. There have only been archaeological missions for a decade in the mid-20th century, a decade in the late 20th century, an excavation campaign in the last decade of the 19th century. It's like that. It is not, there is no systematic research, archaeological excavation research on Ithaca. With regard to the Homer School, Agios Athanasios, it is a remarkable site and has to be promoted, yes, and made accessible to visitors and locals, obviously. With regard to Mycenaean Homer School or Homeric Homer School, allow me to wait. People, archaeologists, have to do their job, or they should do their job. They know how to do it. They know there are ethics in archaeology, as in any occupation. If they follow their ethics, they must convince us. We all archaeologists have published our work, some in extreme detail. They should do the same. However, having said that, it is not only an archaeological issue. There are many stakeholders in this case. Do we want the truth, or do we want a tourist attraction? The local population is a stakeholder. They want something. They demand something. They pay for it. So what an archaeologist should do, according to his ethics, do his job properly and tell what and publish what he has found, or follow the wave, ride the wave, so everyone is happy. I don't know the answer.
It's a difficult one, isn't it, Mikey? And,
Yes.
and we look forward to.
And I repeat, it is not a strictly archaeological question. So you don't need only the answer of an archaeologist, but of more people. There are many stakeholders in this case. And to tell you something which bothers me personally is that this whole Homeric question functions as an alibi. So people think, and it's convenient for everyone. We tend to consider what is important and what it is not important. Everything Homeric or Homeric in quotations, Homeric or Mycenaean is important. Yes, that's important. But if it is Venetian, it is not important. No, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you working on Roman archaeology or classical archaeology or Hellenistic archaeology? These things are not important. Only Odysseus is important. If you do not occupy yourself with Odysseus, you are not searching for Odysseus. You are not good. Venetian archaeology, unknown. It's totally unknown. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. They are unprotected. You saw them. Everything is unprotected.
And that's what I was going to ask, Mikey. Like, I take your point that, and we're enjoying the Historical Society, the Ithacan Historical Society is enjoying taking a view of all Ithacan history, and we're interested in all of it, and also the preservation of it, because some beautiful things there that I was shocked to see are not preserved.
Absolutely.
And not,
absolutely.
Not covered, not being restored. Are there any efforts to restore or at least protect these things that you've uncovered?
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. They began about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because a philologist, a famous philologist, Greek philologist, Ioannis Kakridis, saw the situation at Perahori with all these wall paintings crumbling, get looted. He was a member of the Ministry of Education, and archaeology was back then, if I remember well, in the Ministry of Education. And when he returned, he was a famous one in the Academy of Athens, Ioannis Kakridis. And when he returned to Athens, he sued his ministry. Man, what are you doing? Why aren't you protecting all that stuff? And then they started doing something. They restored somehow, as you see, St. John at Perahori. Of course, that at Anoyi was restored excellently, but it was in a very good state of preservation already in the early 80s, 1980s. And fortunately, it remains. We still have it, we can see it. But there are many, many, many things to be done, and they are known. I mean, people who, that's for their profession, they know about this. I have informed them all. They know.
Good. Well, forums like this, we'd like to also publish, by speaking about it in forums like this, Mikey, the more people are made aware of it, the better it is, and hopefully you'll get more support to ensure that these works are preserved and looked at, and more manpower is put into studying them, protecting them, and restoring them as well. So we look forward to that. So we really appreciate your lecture tonight. We'll just have. I'll conclude the formal section now, Maki. So I'll stop the YouTube, and could be another couple of questions going forward, and then we will